I've been in the Navy 19 years. I've watched men break on the grinder. I've watched a chief petty officer cry in a supply closet because his kid stopped calling. I've watched a lot of things I don't talk about at cookouts. But I have never, not once, not in 19 years, watched 1,400 people go completely silent at the same time. Not quiet silent. You know the difference. Quiet is when people stop talking. Silent is when people stop breathing. Silent is when a whole formation forgets it has lungs, and the only sound left on the field is a flag rope tapping against a pole because nobody thought to tie it down. That's what she did. Lieutenant Commander Devika Rasmussen. She stood there in the sun with her files scattered across the deck at her feet, and she said one sentence, and she took 1,440 people's breath and just held it. I'm going to tell you the whole thing, but I need you to understand something first, and I need you to actually hear me when I say it. She didn't win because she was tough. She won because she was patient. And patience, when you've earned the right to use it, is the meanest weapon there is. Let me back it up. Naval Amphibious Base, Little Creek. That's the Virginia side, the Atlantic side, all salt and wind and that particular gray-green water that never really looks warm even in August. Second week of June. The kind of heat that doesn't burn you so much as it sits on you, like a wet dog that won't move. I was a senior chief then. Logistics and readiness, which is a fancy way of saying I was the guy who made sure things arrived where they were supposed to arrive, in the number they were supposed to arrive in, at the hour they were supposed to arrive at. Nobody writes movies about my job. That's fine. I sleep at night. What was happening that week was a joint readiness assessment. Big one. The kind of thing that gets scheduled 18 months out and then gets moved 4 times and then happens anyway, at the worst possible moment, in the worst possible weather. 1,440 personnel on Nimitz Field. I know the number because I counted it. That was literally my job head count against the manifest. 3 separate reconciliations, initial the sheet, hand it to the ops officer. So when people tell this story and they say 1,440 troops, they're not exaggerating for effect. That was the number. I wrote it down. I've still got the photocopy in a shoebox somewhere. Mixed formation. Fleet sailors, a Marine detachment up from Lejeune, some Coast Guard folks, a chunk of a construction battalion, medical, comms, aviation support. Everybody in their own block, everybody sweating through their own uniform, everybody wondering how long the 06s were going to talk. And up front, on a little riser they'd trucked in the assessment cadre, the guys running the show. Which brings me to Commander Wyatt Barlow. All right, I'm going to be fair to him because I think if you're going to tell a story about a man, you owe him fair, even if you didn't like him. And I didn't like him. Wyatt Barlow was a Navy SEAL, and I don't mean that the way people say it at bars. I mean the man had a real record. Somebody I trusted told me he'd been on the ground in places that don't have names you're allowed to say out loud, and had come back from at least one of them carrying a guy who didn't make it, and had never once mentioned it. That's not nothing. That's the opposite of nothing. He was maybe 44, built like a door. Not gym built, you can always tell, but the kind of build a man gets from 20 years of carrying weight up hills that don't care about him. Silver coming in at the temples, hands that looked like they'd been used for things. And he had that thing certain operators get, where they've spent so long being the hardest man in every room that they stop checking whether it's still true. Because here's what happens. A guy like Barlow spends 2 decades in a community where the only currency is what can you physically do, and he gets very good at that currency. He becomes rich in it. And then one day the Navy takes him out of the fight, knees, back, age, whatever, and they put him behind a desk and they give him an assessment cadre and a clipboard. And now he's in rooms full of people who have different currencies. Intelligence, logistics, medicine, signals. Currencies he never learned to count. And instead of learning to count them, he decides they're not money. That's Barlow. That's the whole man in a sentence. He decided that everything he couldn't do was therefore not worth doing. The morning it happened, we'd been on the field about 40 minutes already. Standard stuff. Assessment brief, expectations, the usual speech about how this isn't a punishment, this is an opportunity, which is what people always say right before they punish you. And then Barlow took the mic. He didn't need the mic. That was the first thing I noticed. He had one of those voices that carried on its own, that flat carrying bark you learn on a range. But he took the mic anyway, and he did this thing where he tapped it twice with 2 fingers, and the sound went thock-thock across 1,400 people, and everybody's spine straightened a quarter inch. He liked that. You could see he liked that. "I've been reviewing your readiness packets," he said. That's how he opened, no preamble. "I've been reviewing your readiness packets, and I want to talk to you about a problem." And then he let it hang. Long, uncomfortably long. Somewhere in the back of the Marine block, somebody's boot scraped on the tarmac and it sounded like a gunshot. "The problem," he said, "is that a lot of you have gotten very comfortable being credentialed instead of being capable." Oh, he'd been waiting to say that. You could hear it. That sentence had been living in his mouth for a week. "I read a lot of certifications this month, a lot of schools, a lot of impressive-looking acronyms." He was walking now, slow, back and forth in front of the riser. "Do you know what I did not read? I did not read anything that tells me what any of you would actually do if this base came under fire in the next 90 seconds. Somebody near me shifted their weight. I remember thinking, don't move, he's hunting." "A piece of paper," Barlow said, "cannot bleed for you." Now, I want to be honest here. Some of what he said wasn't wrong. That's the uncomfortable part of this story that people leave out when they tell it, because it's cleaner if Barlow is just a jackass. He wasn't just a jackass. He was a man who had watched real people die because someone somewhere had been credentialed instead of capable, and he had never gotten over it, and he had turned that grief into a religion. The problem with religion is what you do to the people who don't convert. He went about 6 more minutes. He talked about softness. He talked about a Navy that had confused the paperwork of readiness with readiness itself. He got a couple of chuckles from his own cadre. He said something about how we've built an officer corps that can write a beautiful memo about a burning building. And that's when he stopped walking. And that's when he looked at the 4th block from the left. She was standing in the 2nd rank, left side. Not front, not hiding, 2nd rank, where a mid-grade officer stands when she's attached to a unit but not commanding it. Lieutenant Commander Devika Rasmussen. I'd seen her around the base maybe 3, 4 times over the preceding 2 months. She'd come in as some kind of attached staff. The manifest listed her under an office designation I didn't recognize and didn't ask about, because on a base like Little Creek, there are always 6 or 7 people whose job titles are technically true and completely uninformative. Here's what I actually knew about her before that day. This is the whole list. She was maybe 5'4", small, not delicate compact the way a wrench is compact. She had black hair in a bun so tight it looked structural. She wore glasses, the wire kind, and she was constantly pushing them up her nose with one knuckle, and it was the only nervous-looking thing about her, and I would later find out it wasn't nervous at all. It was just a habit from a decade of wearing headsets that pushed frames down. She carried a folder, always, green government folder, corners soft from handling. And she was quiet in a specific way I couldn't place at the time. Not shy quiet, not timid. It was more like, you know how a good hunting dog is quiet, not because it's calm, because it's listening. That's what she was doing, always listening. I remember one time in the chow hall, a couple of junior officers were arguing about something, a scheduling thing, some deconfliction problem. And she was 2 tables over eating, not looking at them. And after about 10 minutes she got up, walked past them, said 4 words without stopping. I couldn't hear what and kept walking. They stopped arguing, just stopped, Both of them sat there staring at the table. I didn't think anything of it at the time. I want you to understand that. I did not think anything of it. She was a small woman with glasses and a folder, and the base was full of small people with folders, and I had 400 pallets to account for. That's how good she was. She was so good at being nobody that even after 19 years of reading people, I read her wrong. Barlow looked at her, and I watched his face do a thing. It's a thing I've seen before on men like him. It's not anger, it's relief. It's the look a man gets when he's been building a point for 10 minutes and hasn't found an example yet, and then the example walks right into his line of sight. He pointed at her with the microphone. "You," he said, "second-rank glasses. 1,400 heads did not turn. That's discipline for you. Nobody turned. But I swear to God you could hear 1,400 people move their eyes. She didn't move. You," he said again, louder, "Rasmussen." He knew her name. That's the detail that changed everything for me later when I sat down and really thought about that day. He knew her name. He didn't ask for it. He didn't squint at a name tape from 40 feet away. He knew it, and he said it before he'd taken a single step toward her. Which means he'd read her file. And he'd made a decision about it. And he'd been carrying that decision onto the field that morning like a round in the chamber. This wasn't a man losing his temper. This was a man executing a plan. "Front and center," he said. And she came. That's the part I'll never forget. She didn't hesitate. She didn't do that half-second flinch people do when the whole world suddenly points at them. She sidestepped out of her rank, walked around the file in front of her, came down the alley between the blocks, and stepped out onto the open tarmac in front of 1,440 people like she'd been asked to come get her mail. Her folder was under her left arm. Her right hand was empty and relaxed at her side. She stopped at a proper distance, came to attention, not a showy attention, a correct one. Heels together, hands cupped, eyes forward, chin level. She was a head and a half shorter than him, maybe more. Standing there in front of him, in front of all of us, she looked like a filing cabinet next to a truck. And the thing is, she knew exactly how that looked. I'm sure of it now. She knew precisely how small she looked, and she walked out there anyway, and she let it be true. That takes something. I don't know a word for it. Whatever it is, most people don't have it. "Commander," she said. 2 syllables. Even, not warm, not cold, just level. The voice of someone acknowledging a fact. Barlow smiled. I hated that smile. I'm going to be honest with you, I hated it in my chest, in a physical place, and I didn't even know her. "Lieutenant Commander Rasmussen," he said to the mic, to the field, not to her. "Attached staff. Been on my base 61 days. My base. He wasn't the base co. He wasn't within 4 rungs of it. But he said my base, and nobody corrected him because who corrects a seal on a riser? 61 days, he said. And in 61 days, Lieutenant Commander Rasmussen has not participated in a single physical readiness event. Not one. He let that land. Not one, he said again. And here's the ugly part. A couple of people in the formation made a sound. A little exhale. Not laughter, nobody was dumb enough to laugh, but that FFFF sound people make when someone gets caught out. She didn't move. "Now I've been told," Barlow said, and now he turned to look at her, and he was still smiling, "that Lieutenant Commander Rasmussen has a medical waiver." He said medical waiver, the way you'd say participation trophy. "I've been told," he continued, "that there's a piece of paper, and there's always a piece of paper, that says Lieutenant Commander Rasmussen doesn't have to do what all of you do. That she doesn't have to run, doesn't have to swim, doesn't have to carry." He turned back to the field. "So I want to ask you all a question, and I want you to think about it honestly." He paused. "If this base was hit right now, this second, and you were down, and you were bleeding out on this deck, He gestured at her without looking at her. Is that who you want dragging you to cover? I want to stop the story for a second, because I've told this part out loud maybe a dozen times over the years, and every single time, somebody interrupts me right here and says, "Why didn't anybody stop him?" And I want to answer that, because I've spent a long time being ashamed of the answer. Nobody stopped him because he was a Navy SEAL on a riser with a microphone, and we were 1,400 people standing in ranks in the sun. Because there were two 06s 20 feet behind him, and they didn't stop him. Because there is a thing that happens to a crowd. I don't care how disciplined the crowd is, where everybody looks at everybody else and thinks someone will say something. And the collective certainty that someone will say something is precisely the reason nobody does. And this is the one I hate, because some part of me, some small mean part I don't like to look at, wanted to see where it went. That's the truth. That's the honest, ugly truth. 1,440 of us stood there and let it happen, and part of the reason we let it happen is that a fight is interesting. I've never forgiven myself for that. Not really. 19 years, and that's the thing I think about at 3 in the morning, not the deployments, that. She hadn't moved. Not a flinch, not a shift. Not a change in her breathing that I could see, and I was maybe 60 feet away with a clear line, and I was looking. Her eyes were forward, her chin was level, her hands were cupped. And Barlow, I think this is what got him. I really do. I think he'd expected something. Tears, maybe. Or anger. Or that flushed, stammering thing people do when they're humiliated and they try to defend themselves and it comes out wrong. He got nothing. He got a small woman in glasses standing at a textbook attention, waiting. And it made him angry. "Give me the folder," he said. She didn't move. "Lieutenant Commander, the folder." And she said, and I heard this, I was close enough, and it was the first thing she'd said since Commander. "With respect, sir, this folder isn't mine to hand over." Quiet, completely calm, not defiant. Explanatory, like she was telling him the mess hall was closed. And Barlow reached out and took it. He didn't grab her. He didn't touch her. I want to be precise about that because precision matters here and because a lot of people have told this story wrong. He never laid a hand on her. Not once, not that day, not ever. What he did was worse, in a way I've never fully been able to explain. He reached out and he took the folder from under her arm. She didn't resist. Her arm just opened and it slid out, and he held it up, and he said to the microphone to 1,440 people, "Let's see what the paperwork says." And he opened it, and he turned it upside down, and he shook it. The pages came out. Not a lot, maybe 15, 20 sheets. They came out and they hit the tarmac and the wind off the water. There was a good wind that morning, out of the northeast, maybe 12 knots. The wind caught some of them and they went skittering across the deck in front of the entire formation. One of them went about 30 feet and stopped against a Marine's boot. He didn't pick it up. He couldn't. He was at attention. He just looked down at it. And Barlow dropped the empty folder on top of the pile and said, "That's what a piece of paper is worth." Silence. Real silence. The first one. There'd be a bigger one coming, but this was the first, and it was bad enough. 1,440 people watching a woman's file blow across a parade deck. And she looked down. That was the only thing she did. She broke her attention, one small thing, one small break in 19 minutes of perfect bearing, and she looked down at the pages on the ground. And I watched her face. And I want to tell you what I saw, and I want you to understand I didn't know what it meant at the time. She wasn't hurt. She wasn't embarrassed. She looked at those pages on the deck the way a woman looks at a broken window in her own house. Not "how could you?" "Oh, you actually did it." Something in her face closed. It wasn't dramatic. It was like a door in a hallway swinging shut 2 rooms away, You barely hear it, but the air pressure changes and you know something's different now. And then she looked back up. And she said, "Sir, may I have permission to speak?" Barlow laughed. He actually laughed, into the mic. It came back off the hanger wall behind us, doubled ugly. "Permission to speak," he said. "She wants permission to speak." He spread his arms out to the formation, playing to the house. "Lieutenant Commander," he said, "you've got 1,400 people right here. You go ahead. You tell them. You explain to every single sailor and Marine on this deck why the rules that apply to them don't apply to you." He held the mic out toward her. He held it out at arm's length, low, the way you'd hold a bone out to a dog. "Go on," he said, "explain the paper." And she took the microphone. And here's the thing. Here's the thing I noticed and nobody else did, because everybody else was looking at Barlow. Her hand didn't shake. Not a tremor. Nothing. 1,440 people, her career on the deck in pieces at her feet, a decorated seal standing over her like a wall, and her hand came up and closed around that microphone as steady as a bolt going into a threaded hole. I have thought about that hand for 11 years. Because a hand doesn't lie. A voice can lie. A face can lie. Bearing can lie. Bearing is literally a trained lie. We teach it. We drill it. We make 18-year-olds practice not showing what they feel. But a hand that's steady in that moment, that's not training. That's a person who has been in a worse room than this one. She brought the mic up. She adjusted her glasses with one knuckle. She looked out at 1,440 people, and I swear she took her time about it. She went left to right, block by block, like she was counting us. And she said, "My name is Devika Rasmussen." Pause. Some of you have seen me around. Most of you haven't. Pause. Commander Barlow is right about the waiver. I have one. It's permanent. I will never run a PRT again, and I will never pass one, and there is no version of my future in which that changes. Nobody breathed. And Commander Barlow is right that there's a piece of paper. There's more than one, actually. She glanced down at the deck, at the sheets skittering in the wind. Some of them are down there. He's welcome to read them. He'll need a clearance he doesn't have, but he's welcome to try. Barlow's face. Oh, Barlow's face. She lifted the mic again. "But he asked me a question," she said, "in front of all of you, and it deserves an answer. He asked whether I'm who you'd want dragging you to cover." She let that sit. 12 knots of wind, a rope tapping a pole. And then Lieutenant Commander Devika Rasmussen said, "Sir, on the 11th of March, 3 years ago, you were in a building that was on fire in a country I'm not going to name in front of 1,400 people." Barlow went white. Not pale white. "You had 11 minutes of air support that you were never supposed to have," she said, "and a corridor out that wasn't on any map you were issued, and a voice in your ear that told you which way to turn." She adjusted her glasses. "Sir, I'm not who you'd want dragging you to cover. Beat. I'm the reason you never needed it. There's a sound a crowd makes when it doesn't know what it just heard. It isn't a gasp. Movies get that wrong. A real crowd doesn't gasp. A gasp is a decision, and a decision takes a half second, and this was faster than that. What 1,440 people actually did was stop. Every single body on that deck locked. Not from discipline, from confusion. 1,440 nervous systems all trying to run the same calculation at once and all coming back with the same error message. Did she just... Wait, back up, did she just say? And underneath that the sound. Not a sound exactly, a pressure change, like the field itself had inhaled. I have never heard anything like it, not before, not since. Barlow didn't move. I need you to picture this properly, because this is the image that hangs in my head at 3 in the morning, more than the file on the deck, more than anything else. A very large man, standing in the sun, in front of 1,400 people, with his arm still half extended in the air. The arm he'd used to hand her the microphone. He'd never brought it back down. He was just standing there with his hand out, like a man reaching for a door that wasn't there anymore, and his mouth was slightly open, and he wasn't looking at her. He was looking past her, about 6 feet past her at nothing, at a patch of tarmac. And his eyes were doing something I've only seen a handful of times in 19 years, and every single time it was a man remembering something he'd promised himself he'd stopped remembering. She didn't press. That's the thing. That's the whole thing, and I want to make sure you catch it, because everybody who tells this story gets it wrong. They tell it like a takedown, like a mic drop, like she'd been sitting on that card for 61 days waiting to slap it on the table. She hadn't. I know she hadn't, because of what she did next. She lowered the microphone. She lowered it, away from her mouth, down to her side, in the exact moment when any normal human being on this earth would have raised it, when she had 1,400 people's undivided attention and a broken man in front of her, and every reason in the world to finish him. She put the weapon down. And she said, quietly, not into the mic, just to him, so quiet that I only caught it because the whole field had gone airless. Sir, I shouldn't have said that here. I don't think anybody else heard it. Maybe 6 people, maybe 8. The cadre on the riser, the front rank of the 4th block, me, that's it. But I heard it, and it rearranged something in my head that has never gone back to where it was. I shouldn't have said that here. Not you deserved that, not you started it, not how does that feel. She was apologizing. She had just been hollowed out in front of 1,440 people. Her file was blowing across the deck. A man had held a microphone out to her like a bone to a dog, and she had hit back exactly once, one sentence, and the moment it landed, she looked at what she'd done, and the first thing out of her mouth was that she shouldn't have done it. I've thought about why for 11 years. Here's what I've got. It wasn't kindness. She wasn't being nice to him. She didn't like him. I found that out later, and I'll get to it. It was that she had said something out loud, in front of 1,400 people, that was never supposed to be said out loud in front of anybody. She hadn't beaten him. She'd broken protocol. And she knew it before the echo came back off the hangar wall. Now, let me tell you what happened in the next 90 seconds, because it was chaos, and it was the quietest chaos I've ever been part of. Nobody moved. 1,440 people, and not one boot came off the deck. That's the part that gets me. That's discipline that goes deeper than training goes. That's 1,400 people who all understood, at the exact same instant, with no one telling them, that whatever had just happened was not for them. You could feel it move through the formation, this wave, this close your ears thing. Guys who'd been leaning forward on the balls of their feet 10 seconds earlier, hungry for it, wanting the fight. I watched them straighten up and go dead-eyed and stare at the back of the head in front of them like their lives depended on seeing nothing. Because they'd figured it out. Maybe not the details. Nobody had the details. But every experienced person on that deck had just watched a small woman in glasses say a date and a country-shaped hole and 11 minutes of air support, and had watched a SEAL commander go the color of a bedsheet, and had done the math. She's not staff. She was never staff. Oh God, what did we just hear? Captain Aurelio Vance broke it. He was the senior officer on the riser, big Coast Guard captain, red-faced, permanently sunburned, the kind of man who looked like he'd been assembled out of rope and disappointment. He'd been standing back there through the whole thing with his hands behind his back and his jaw getting tighter and tighter, and I'd been watching him, and I'd been thinking, say something, sir, for the love of God, say something, and he hadn't. He said something now. He came off that riser fast for a man his size. 3 steps, and he took the microphone out of her hand, Gently, actually. He took it the way you'd take scissors off a kid, and he put it under his arm and he said, in a voice that carried without the mic at all, "Formation is dismissed. Block leaders, march your people off, now." Nobody moved. "Now," Vance said. And the deck came alive. You want to know what 1,440 people leaving a parade deck sounds like, when every single one of them wants to talk, and not one of them is allowed to. Boots, just boots, a wall of boots and nothing else. No chatter, no jokes, no scuffling. 1,400 people marching off a field in total verbal silence, and every last one of them screaming inside their own skull. I stood there. I was supposed to move. My block was moving. My own block was walking away from me, and I was standing on the deck like an idiot with my clipboard in my hand. Because there were pages on the tarmac, and nobody was picking them up. Here's what I did, and it's the only thing in this entire story that I'm actually proud of, and it's such a small thing that I'm almost embarrassed to tell you. I picked up the pages. That's it. That's the whole heroic act. Senior Chief Merrick Solano, 19 years in the United States Navy, went down on one knee on hot tarmac in front of a dispersing formation and picked up 20 sheets of paper. Some of them had gotten pretty far. One had gone under a light pole. One had blown against the base of the riser. One was still under a Marine's boot. He'd stayed at attention over it the entire time, this kid, 20 years old maybe, and when I came over he stepped back off it and looked at me and said, "I didn't step on it, Senior Chief. I didn't step on it." Like it mattered to him, like it really mattered to him. I said, "I know you didn't, good man." And his face did something, and he went to catch up with his block. I stacked them. I didn't read them. I want to be clear about that, and I want you to believe me because you're allowed not to. But I didn't read them. I stacked them face down, corner aligned, the way you do, and I put them back in the green folder and I picked up the folder. And when I stood up, she was standing there. Right in front of me, maybe 4 feet. I hadn't heard her come over. That woman did not make noise when she walked. I'd swear to that in a court. She looked at the folder in my hands. And then she looked at me. And she said the first thing she ever said to me. 19 years in the Navy, and this is the sentence that starts it. "You didn't read them." Not a question. I said, "No, ma'am." She said, "How do you know I'd care?" And I said, and this just came out, I didn't plan it. It was the truest thing in my chest, and it got past the gate. "Because they were on the ground, ma'am, and that was enough." She looked at me for a long time. Long enough that it got uncomfortable. Long enough that I started to think I'd said something wrong. Her eyes were very dark and very still, and there was absolutely nothing in them that told me what she was thinking, and I remember thinking, this is what she does. This is her whole job. She looks at people and she gives them nothing back and they fill the silence themselves. Then she took the folder. She said, "Thank you, Senior Chief." She'd read my name tape, of course she had. And she started to walk away, and she got about 5 steps and she stopped, and she turned back around. And she said, "You were counting." I said, "Ma'am." She said earlier when he was talking, "You were counting the formation. I watched you do it twice." I said, "It's my job, ma'am." And she said something then that I did not understand for 2 more days, and when I finally understood it, I had to sit down on a bench outside the mess hall and put my head in my hands. She said, "Nobody else on that deck was counting." And she walked away. The base went insane. I mean that. I mean the base went absolutely, comprehensively insane in the quietest possible way for about 11 hours. Because here's the thing about the military. You cannot unsee 1,400 people watching something. You can order silence, and they did. Within about 40 minutes there was a very clear order come down through every chain on that base that the morning's formation was not to be discussed. in any forum, verbal or written, full stop. And that order was worded in a way I had never seen an order worded before. But you can't order people to unknow. And so what happened instead of talking was looking. You'd pass a guy in a passageway and he'd look at you, and you'd look at him, and neither of you would say a word, and you'd both keep walking, and you'd both know exactly what the other one was thinking. The chow hall that night was the loudest silent room I have ever eaten in. Rumors got out anyway, they always do. Water finds a crack. By 1500 there were 4 versions going around, and I heard all 4, and every single one was wrong. Version 1. She was NCIS and Barlow was under investigation and she'd been sent to watch him. Version 2. She was CIA, actual agency, and she'd been embedded on the base for 2 months and nobody knew why. Version 3. And this one was the most popular and the most stupid, was that she'd been a SEAL herself, some classified program, and the medical waiver was from an injury on an op, and Barlow had known and had done the whole thing out of jealousy. Version 4 was that the whole thing was a staged readiness exercise, and we'd all failed it. I want to tell you that I was smart enough to know they were all garbage. I wasn't. I half believed version 2 for about 6 hours. The truth was smaller than all of them. The truth was smaller and quieter and about 400 times worse. I found out because of Chief Warrant Officer Yona Petrakis. Petrakis ran comms support. 26 years in. Built like a fire hydrant, smoked like a chimney, had a laugh you could hear through a bulkhead, and had, "This is important," absolutely no fear of anything on God's earth, including officers, including admirals, and including, as it turned out, Wyatt Barlow. I found her out behind the comms shack at about 1900 that night, sitting on an overturned milk crate, smoking. She looked up at me and said, "You picked up the paper." I said, "News travels." She said, "Sit down, Solano." I sat down on the ground, because there was only one crate. And she smoked for about a minute and a half without saying anything. And then she said, "You know what the worst part is?" I said, "Which worst part?" She said, "He knew." I said, "What?" She said it again, slower. "He knew, Merk." And she looked at me, and there was something in her face I'd never seen on Yona Petrakis in 6 years of knowing her, and it took me a second to identify it. And when I did, it went through me like cold water. She was scared. Not scared of getting in trouble. Scared the way you get scared when you find out the world is arranged differently than you thought it was. "He read her file," she said. "Not the paper file, the file. He had access. He's an 05 with an assessment cadre. He can pull attached staff jackets. That's a legitimate function. So he pulled hers 61 days ago, the week she got here." I said, "So he knew she had a waiver. Everybody knew." "No," she stubbed the cigarette out on the concrete hard. "No, Merk, listen to me. He didn't just know she had a waiver." She looked at me. "He knew why." I have replayed the next 30 seconds of my life more times than I can count. Because that was the moment. That was the moment where the whole day turned inside out and became a different day, a worse day, a day I'd been standing in without understanding it. I said, "Yona, what are you telling me?" And she said, "Her file has a redaction block on the medical section. Full block. You can't see the condition, you can't see the cause, you can't see the date. All you get is the code and the authority." Okay. The authority, Merk. And I still didn't have it. I want you to know that. I sat there on the concrete like a moron and I did not have it. She said very quietly, "The authority line on her medical waiver is the same command that ran the 11th of March. I sat there. The floodlight on the comms shack was buzzing. There was a mosquito on my wrist and I didn't move to kill it. She was there, I said. She wasn't there. Petrakis lit another cigarette and her hands weren't steady. That's the whole point. That's the thing you're not getting. Nobody's saying she was on the ground. She's a voice, Merrick. She's a voice in a room with a headset and 11 screens and a chair, and she sits in that room for 14 hours at a stretch, and she talks men through buildings. She took a drag, and 3 years ago she talked him through one. And the waiver, I said. Yeah, the waiver's from the same op. The waiver, Petraki said, is authorized by the command that ran that op. That's all I know. That's all the system will show me, and I already looked at more than I'm allowed to look at, and if anybody ever asks, this conversation didn't happen. I said, Iona. It didn't happen, Merk. I said, okay. We sat there. And then I said the thing that had been forming in my chest since about 9:30 that morning and had finally gotten enough weight to fall out of my mouth. I said, Iona, if he knew she was on the 11th of March. And she said, yeah. Then he knew she'd be able to say it. And Chief Warrant Officer Iona Petrakis, 26 years in the United States Navy, looked at the ground between her boots and said, that's right. Let me lay it out. Let me lay it out the way I laid it out for myself, sitting on that concrete with a mosquito on my wrist and my whole understanding of that morning coming apart in my hands. Wyatt Barlow read her file 61 days before that formation. He knew she'd been the voice on the 11th of March. He knew she was the reason he'd had 11 minutes of air support he was never supposed to have. He knew she was the reason he'd known which corridor was clear. He knew she'd saved his life, and the lives of every man he'd walked out of that building with, and he knew she had a medical waiver, permanent, tied to that command. And knowing all of that, knowing it, he walked out onto Nimitz Field on the 2nd week of June and picked her out of the 4th block and held a microphone out at arm's length and asked 1,440 people whether they'd want that dragging them to cover. Why? Why? That was the question. That was the question that ate me for 2 days. That's the question I turned over and over on that concrete and in my rack that night and at 400 staring at the ceiling. Because here's the thing that makes it so much worse. A man doesn't do that by accident. A man doesn't do that in a rage. A man does that on purpose. And I got it wrong. I want to be honest with you, because I've been honest so far and I'm not going to stop now. I got it wrong. For 2 days I had a theory, and my theory was shame. I thought, he can't stand it. He can't stand that he owes his life to a woman in glasses who can't run a mile. He spent 20 years believing that the only thing that keeps a man alive is what he can physically do. And then one night in a burning building he found out that isn't true. He found out he lived because somebody thought fast, not because anybody ran fast, and it broke his religion. And he's been carrying that for 3 years. And when she showed up on his base, he decided to destroy the evidence. That was my theory. It's a good theory. It's clean. It makes him a villain, and it makes her a saint, and it makes the story easy. And I believed it hard for 48 hours. And then on Thursday afternoon I went to find her to return something, and she told me the truth, and I have never in my life been so completely, so thoroughly, so stupidly wrong about a man. Because Wyatt Barlow hadn't done it out of shame. He'd done it because it was the only way he had left to make somebody listen. I had a pen. That's how it started. That's the whole reason I ended up in a room I had no business being in, on a Thursday afternoon, hearing something I've never repeated in full to another living soul until right now. A pen. When I'd stacked her pages on the deck Tuesday morning, one of them had been clipped, one of those cheap black binder clips, the little ones, and clipped to the clip was a pen, government ballpoint, the kind they buy by the gross, worth about 11 cents. And it had come loose in my hand when I picked the sheets up, and I'd shoved it in my breast pocket without thinking, and it had gone through the wash, and I'd found it Thursday morning in a pile of my own laundry, and I had stood there in my own quarters holding an 11-cent pen and thinking. This isn't mine. I could have thrown it away. Any sane man throws it away. I didn't throw it away. I found out where her office was by asking the wrong person twice and the right person once. It wasn't an office. It was a room in the back of the old training annex, the building everybody called the icebox because the HVAC had been broken since the 90s, and it was 38 degrees in there in August. Half that building was storage. The other half was rooms with cipher locks and no signage. Hers had no signage. It had a cipher lock and a piece of masking tape on the door with a number written on it in Sharpie. That was it. That was the sum total of the identifying information on the door of a woman who had talked a SEAL commander out of a burning building. I stood in that hallway for a good 90 seconds. I want to tell you I was brave. I wasn't. I was standing there thinking, turn around, Merrick. You are a senior chief with a stupid pen, and you are about to knock on a door that has a cipher lock on it, and there is a non-zero chance that somebody in a suit comes and talks to you about it afterward. And then the door opened on its own, and she was standing there with her coat on her way out, and we both just stopped. She looked at me. She looked at the pen in my hand. And Lieutenant Commander Devika Rasmussen, who I had watched 2 days earlier, absorb the worst public humiliation I have ever seen a human being absorb, without so much as a change in her breathing, made a sound. It was small. It was maybe half a laugh. It got about a quarter of the way out of her, and then she caught it. And she said, "You're kidding." I said, "Ma'am, it went through the wash. I don't know if it still works." And she took it from me, and she clicked it twice, and she looked at the tip and she said, "It works." And then she said, "Come in, Senior Chief." The room was freezing. Not cool, freezing. She had a space heater running under the desk in June and a cardigan over the back of the chair, and there was a mug on the desk with the string of a tea bag hanging over the side, and the mug said World's OKAYEST Sister on it. And I have never in my life been so disoriented by a coffee mug. There were no photos. I noticed that immediately because everybody has photos. 19 years, every desk I have ever seen in the United States Navy has a photo on it. Kids, dogs, a boat, somebody's wedding, something. She had a wall. She had a wall, and on the wall she had nothing. Bare. Painted cinder block, that institutional green, and one clock, and that was it. And I remember standing in that doorway thinking, she's been here 63 days and she hasn't put up a single thing. And then thinking, no, she's been in 100 rooms like this and she's never put up a single thing anywhere. That's what the job does. She sat down. She gestured at the other chair I sat. She put the pen in a drawer. And then she looked at me, and she folded her hands and she said, "You want to ask me something?" I said, "No, ma'am." She said, "Senior Chief." I said, "I really don't, ma'am. I brought your pen." And she looked at me for a long moment, and something in her face changed. Softened isn't the word. She didn't do soft but shifted, the way a stone shifts, a quarter inch, when the ground under it settles. And she said, "That's the first true thing anybody's said to me on this base in 9 weeks." And then she told me. I didn't ask. I want that on the record. I sat in a cold room on a hard chair with my cover in my lap, and I did not ask her a single question, and she told me anyway, and I have spent 11 years trying to understand why. I think, and I could be wrong, I've been wrong about all of this before. I think she'd been carrying it alone for 3 years, and I was just the first person who came through the door who hadn't wanted anything. "How much do you think you know?" she said. I said, "About the 11th of March. About Wyatt." That stopped me. Wyatt, not Barlow, not the commander. I said, "I think he's a man who couldn't stand owing his life to somebody who can't run." And she closed her eyes. She closed her eyes and she put her fingers on the bridge of her nose, under her glasses, and she sat like that for about 4 seconds. And then she said, "God, is that what people think?" I said, "Yes, ma'am, that's what people think." And she said, "That's going to kill him." Now, I'm going to tell you what she told me. And I'm going to tell it the way she told it, as close as I can get, because I've never been able to improve on it and I'm not going to try. But I need to warn you about something first. You've been listening to this story for a while now, and I know what you've got in your head. You've got a villain in a risor and a hero in glasses, and a moment where the hero destroys the villain with one sentence, and it feels good. It feels clean. And I know it does because I wanted it to feel that way too. It doesn't hold. I'm sorry. It doesn't hold, and it didn't hold for me either. And the day it stopped holding, I sat on a bench outside a mess hall in Virginia and put my head in my hands for about 20 minutes. And a lieutenant came by and asked if I was okay, and I said yes, and I wasn't. "Here it is. There were 9 of them in that building," she said. Flat, just facts. She talked about it the way you'd read a manifest. Wyatt's element, 9. The structure was 3 floors and a sublevel, and the sublevel was where the thing we wanted was, and the plan was 40 minutes on the deck and out. The plan was fine. The plan was good, actually. I'd worked it. I knew every inch of it. I'd been looking at that building for 11 weeks. She turned the mug a quarter turn on the desk. Didn't drink from it. "The building went up at minute 19. "Went up," I said. "Not our doing. Somebody in there decided nobody was leaving. Accelerant on the 2nd floor and the stairwell all at once. Whoever did it knew what they were doing." She said it like a weather report. Now, 9 men in a burning building with 1 stairwell. Wyatt's on the sublevel with 3 others. There are 2 on 2, 3 on 3. The stairwell is gone. The comms in that building were, she waved a hand, it was concrete and rebar, and now it was concrete and rebar and fire, so what I had was fragments. Wyatt's voice for 8 seconds, then nothing for 40. Then somebody else. Then nothing. She looked up at me. "You want to know what my job actually is, Senior Chief?" Everybody always wants the exciting answer. Here's the real one. My job is that I had 11 screens and a headset, and I had spent 11 weeks looking at that building, and I had looked at the ventilation. "The ventilation," I said. The building had been a food processing facility in the 80s, which meant it had a refrigeration plant, which meant it had chase runs, big ones, for the coolant lines, and the chase runs went from the sublevel to the roof, and they were not on the floor plan we were issued, because the floor plan we were issued was from the 90s, after they'd converted it, and whoever drew that plan didn't bother to draw the guts of a building that wasn't a food plant anymore. She stopped. But I'd found a 1987 municipal permit application, 8 weeks before the op, in a language I don't speak, in a records archive that wasn't digitized, that I had to have scanned, page by page, by a contractor who had no idea what he was scanning and who charged us $400 for it. She said, $400. And then she said, very quietly, "Cheapest thing the Navy bought that year." I sat there in that cold room, and I felt the floor move. "So you told him," I said. "I told him where the chase was. I told him it came up on the north face, and that the grating on it was 50 years old, and that 4 men could get it off if 3 of them were pulling in the same direction." She adjusted her glasses with 1 knuckle. "And I told the air asset, which we did not have, which we were not supposed to have, which was 31 minutes away on a different tasking, and which I got by lying to a colonel. I told the air asset that if it was not on the north face of that building in 22 minutes, it would be flying over 9 bodies. And it came. It came. And all 9. And she stopped. She stopped and she looked at the wall. The bare wall, the one with nothing on it. And she said, 7. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. I sat in a chair in a 38-degree room in June, and I listened to a clock. 7 came out, she said. The two on the second floor never made the chase. They were the closest to it when it started, and they were the ones who didn't get out, that's how it works actually. That's not irony, that's just how fire works. The closest ones go first. She stopped again. Then, Petty Officer First Class Casimir Alderit, Chief Petty Officer Tamaz Brakij. She said both names very carefully, the way you'd carry something breakable across a room. I've never said those names out loud on this base, she said. You're the first. Ma'am, I said, that wasn't. Don't. She held up a hand. Not angry, just done. Please don't finish that sentence, Senior Chief. I know what's at the end of it, and I have heard it from 4 psychiatrists and my sister and a chaplain, and I'm not going to argue with you about it because you'd win because you're right, and it doesn't matter that you're right. She took a breath. 7 came out. Wyatt carried one of them 90 meters, and then they went back. They went back. They went back, she said, for the 2. Into a building that was fully involved, on a stairwell that no longer existed, at minute 41. And I sat in a chair 4,000 miles away, and I told them not to. The clock on the wall was the only sound in that room. I ordered them not to, she said. I had the authority. Barely, I had it barely, and I used it. And I told Wyatt Barlow that the building was going to come down in under 4 minutes, and that if he went back in, he would put 5 more men in it. Was that true? And she said, it came down in 6 minutes. I sat there and I did that math, and I felt something go cold in me that has never entirely warmed back up. 6 minutes, she'd said 4, she'd been off by 2. Ma'am, I said, and my voice came out wrong, 2 minutes. 2 minutes is not enough to go down 2 floors and come back up a chase with a man on your back, she said. I know. I've done the math. I have done the math, Senior Chief, more times than I have done anything else in my entire life, and the answer is always the same, and the answer is no. He could not have gotten them. Nobody could have gotten them. She looked at me. And Wyatt Barlow does not believe me. There it was. There it was, and it went through me like a rail spike, and I finally understood what I had actually watched on Nimitz Field on Tuesday morning. He thinks you lied to him, I said. No, she shook her head. God, no, that's the no. Wyatt doesn't think I lied. She leaned forward. Wyatt thinks I was right. I didn't get it. I sat there and I didn't get it, and she watched me not get it, and she waited, and eventually she said it plainly, the way you eventually have to say things plainly to people like me. He thinks I was right, she said, and he obeyed me, and he stood on a road 90 meters from that building, and he watched it come down with 2 of his men inside it. And he has spent 3 years knowing that the reason he didn't go back in is that a woman in a chair 4,000 miles away told him not to. She said, and he lives. She said, and they don't. And then she said the thing I've never been able to put down. He doesn't hate me because I saved him, Senior Chief. That's what everyone gets wrong. He hates me because I saved him instead of them, and he's decided that means he owes them something, and the only currency he has is himself. So Tuesday, I said, and my voice was not working properly. Tuesday, she said. He knew you'd say it. He knew you were the only person on this base who could say it. Yes. He read your file 61 days ago, and he waited for a formation of 1,440 people, and he stood you up in front of all of them, and he shook your file out on the deck. Yes, because he wanted you to say it. And Lieutenant Commander Devika Rasmussen looked at me across a government desk in a freezing cold room in the back of a building nobody went into, and she said, he wanted somebody to know. I have thought about this for 11 years, and I still can't hold all of it in my head at one time. It's too big. It's like trying to look at the whole of a building while you're standing against the wall of it. Here's the closest I can get. Wyatt Barlow could not say what happened on the 11th of March. Not to a chaplain, not to his wife, not to a psychiatrist, not to his own men, especially not to his own men. The thing was classified, and he was a professional, and in 20 years he had never once broken a classification, and he was not going to start. But he was drowning. He'd been drowning for 3 years and nobody knew, because he was Wyatt Barlow, and Wyatt Barlow does not drown. And the only 2 people on this earth who knew what he'd stood on that road and watched were dead in the rubble of it. And the third person was a voice in his ear. And then one day, the voice showed up on his base. 61 days. He sat with it for 61 days. And then he built the only confession booth a man like that can build. He built one out of a parade deck and a microphone and 1,440 witnesses, and a woman's file scattered across the tarmac, and he stood in it, and he made her say it out loud. Because he could not. Because the only way Wyatt Barlow could get anybody in the world to know what had happened to him was to be so unforgivably cruel to the one person who knew, in public, that she would have no choice but to hit back with the only thing she had. He didn't humiliate her to destroy her. He humiliated her to make her speak. I said, and I could hardly get it out, "Ma'am, that's the most." And I didn't have a word. I still don't have a word. I've been looking for 11 years. Selfish isn't right. Broken isn't right. Cruel is right, but it isn't enough. It doesn't cover the whole surface of the thing. She said, "I know." And then she said, "He's not a monster, Senior Chief. That's what makes it unbearable. A monster would be easy." I said, "What are you going to do?" And she said, "Nothing." I said, "Ma'am." She said, "Senior Chief, listen to me carefully because I'm about to tell you something and then I'm going to ask you to leave." She took her glasses off. That was the first time. 63 days on that base, and I don't think anybody had ever seen Devika Rasmussen without her glasses on. And she took them off and set them on the desk and rubbed her eyes, and she looked, for about 3 seconds, like a 41-year-old woman who had not slept properly since March of 3 years ago. And she said, "There is going to be an investigation. It started Tuesday afternoon. Captain Vance opened it before the formation was off the field, and he was right too, and it is going to find that Commander Wyatt Barlow committed a serious violation of Article 133 in front of 1,440 people, and it is going to end his career." "Good," I said. And she said, "No. He will not fight it," she said. "That's what nobody understands yet. He's not going to fight it. He's not going to hire counsel. He's not going to say a word in his own defense because he can't. Because the only defense he has is the 11th of March, and he will die before he says it in a room without a clearance, and he knows that, and he knew it on Tuesday morning when he walked out onto that deck." She put her glasses back on. "He built a machine to end himself, Senior Chief, and he used me as the hammer, and he did it in front of 1,440 people so that it could not be stopped." The clock ticked. "And in about 11 days, she said, the investigating officer is going to ask me for a statement, under oath, in writing." She looked at me. "And I am the only person alive who can save him." And then she said, "And I don't know if I'm going to. 11 days. You'd think 11 days would go slow. It didn't. It went like water down a drain. You look at it and it's already almost gone, and you never see the moment it goes. I want to tell you what those 11 days were like on that base because it wasn't what you'd expect. It wasn't drama. Nobody screamed. Nobody got in a fight in a parking lot. The Navy doesn't do that. What the Navy does is it goes very, very polite, and that's how you know it's serious. Everybody said, 'Good morning, Commander,' to Wyatt Barlow. Everybody. Perfectly, correctly, with the exact right amount of courtesy and not 1 degree more. 1,440 people had watched that man on Nimitz Field, and every single one of them, for 11 straight days, greeted him with flawless military courtesy. It was the worst thing I have ever seen done to a human being, and no one laid a finger on him, and every last bit of it was regulation. He kept working. That's the part that got under my skin. He didn't hide. They'd have found him a desk somewhere out of sight. That's standard. That's what you do with a man under investigation. He didn't take it. Every morning at 5:30 he was on the seawall running. Every morning. 6 miles, I think. Same route. And every morning there'd be 4 or 5 sailors out there running too, and they'd see him coming and they'd move to the other side of the path. Not hostile, just aside. He never once looked at them. I watched it happen on day 6. I was out there early because I couldn't sleep. And I stood at the rail and I watched Commander Wyatt Barlow run past a group of 3 young sailors who stepped off the path to let him through. And I watched him not turn his head, and I watched him keep running, and something in the way he was running was wrong. I couldn't put it together at first. Then I got it. He wasn't running like a man doing PT. He was running like a man who does not have anywhere to be. Chief Warrant Officer Petrakis found me on day 7. She sat down across from me in the chow hall, and she put her tray down and she said, without any preamble at all, "Barlow gave away his dog." I said, "What?" She said, "His neighbors got it. Big shepherd. He knocked on the door Sunday night and handed her the leash and the food and the vet paperwork and said he was going to be traveling." I put my fork down. Petraki said, "That's what I thought too. I need to be careful here. I'm going to tell you what I did next, and I need you to understand that I am not proud of it, and I am not ashamed of it either, and it sits in a place in my chest that doesn't have a name. I went to see him. His office was in the assessment annex. Nice building, new, air conditioning that worked, which after the icebox felt obscene. The door was open. He was sitting at his desk with a stack of folders, and he was signing things, actually doing the job, on day 7 of an investigation that everyone on that base knew was going to end him. And he looked up and saw a senior chief in his doorway, and he said, "Senior Chief Solano." He knew my name too. Of course he did. He knew everybody's name. That's the thing about men like Barlow that people miss when they're busy hatting them the attention. He'd read 1,400 names. I said, "Sir, permission to speak freely." And he put his pen down. And he said, "No." I stood there. He said, "Sit down, Senior Chief." I sat. And he said, "You want to ask me why I did it. And I'm not going to let you ask me, because if you ask me I'll have to lie to you, and you picked up her paper off the deck, so I'm not going to lie to you." I didn't say anything. He said, "That's the only thing I've done right in 3 years, is that, right there, not lying to a senior chief in a doorway." Up close he looked terrible. I hadn't seen it from 60 feet on the parade deck, and I hadn't seen it from the seawall. Up close, in a fluorescent-lit office, Commander Wyatt Barlow looked like a house that people had moved out of. He was still built like a door. That doesn't leave you, but his eyes had gone somewhere and left the building running on its own. He said, "You've talked to her." It wasn't a question. I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "How is she?" That's what he asked. 7 days into the end of his own career, in an office where he was signing readiness assessments he'd never see the results of, having given away his dog on Sunday night. "How is she?" I sat there, and I could not make my mouth work. He said, "Senior Chief, I've asked you a question." And I said, "She's carrying 2 names, sir." And Wyatt Barlow closed his eyes. "Alderete," he said, "and Brackage." "Yes, sir." Cass had a kid on the way. He was still looking at the ceiling. He didn't tell anybody. He told me 4 days before, and he made me swear not to say it because he thought it'd make the guys treat him different on the deck. And I never told anybody. And then he was gone and I couldn't tell anybody because I'd sworn. He said, "Do you know what it's like to be the only person who knows a thing?" I said, "No, sir." And he said, "Neither did she, until 3 years ago." I want to try to explain something, and I don't know if I can. I went into that office hatting him. I want you to know that. I had walked across the base with a fire in my sternum, and I had gone in there ready to do something stupid. And I sat in that chair for 11 minutes, and I came out the other side with nothing to burn. Because here's what I finally understood, sitting there. He knew exactly what he had done to her. Every inch of it, every single second of it. He had not done it in a fog. He had not done it in a rage. He had chosen it deliberately with full knowledge, and he had known precisely what it would cost her, and he had done it anyway. And he was not going to defend himself. And he was not going to ask for her help. And he was not going to apologize either, not because he wasn't sorry, but because he had decided that an apology was something he had no right to have. That is a man who has already sentenced himself. The investigation was just paperwork. I said, "Sir, she can end this. One statement, and this all goes away." And he said, "I know." I said, "Sir." And Wyatt Barlow leaned forward across that desk and said, in a voice that I have never forgotten, that was so quiet and so reasonable that it was worse than any shout I've ever heard, "Senior Chief, if she puts the 11th of March in a statement to save my career, then the last useful thing she ever did with it was save me." He said, "Again." He picked his pen back up. "I'm not going to let her spend it on me twice." I went and found her. I didn't plan it. I walked out of that building and I did not go back to my shop, and I did not go to Chow, and I walked straight to the icebox, and I knocked on a door with masking tape on it, and when she opened it I said, "He gave away his dog." And Devika Rasmussen stood in that doorway, and the color went out of her face. She sat down. Not in the chair, on the floor. She went down on the floor of that freezing room with her back against the filing cabinet, and she put her hands over her mouth and she sat there. I stood there like an idiot. She said through her hands, "That stupid, stupid man." And then she got up. I want you to understand how fast. 4 seconds on that floor and then she was up, and the thing that had been in her face was gone, and what was there instead was something I'd only seen once, on Tuesday morning on the parade deck, right after she'd said it, when she'd looked at the pages on the ground and something had closed. That thing, that door swinging shut 2 rooms away. She said, "Senior Chief, I need you to leave." I said, "Ma'am." She said, "I need you to leave, and I need you to not come back to this building, and I need you to never tell anyone that you were in it." And she was already reaching for the phone. I want to tell you what happened next. I can't tell all of it. There are pieces of the next 4 days that I did not see, and that I have never been told, and that I have made my peace with never knowing. Here's what I know. She made calls. I know that because Petrakis told me the comms logs looked like a Christmas tree for about 72 hours and then got locked so hard she couldn't even see that they existed anymore. On day 9, 2 people came onto that base who were not in uniform and who did not sign the visitor log, which is not possible, which is literally not possible, and which happened anyway. On day 10, Captain Aurelio Vance's investigation was suspended pending review by an external authority, which is a phrase that appears in Navy paperwork approximately never. And on day 11, at 700, a formation was called on Nimitz Field. 1,440 people. Same field, same blocks, same wind off the water. It was hotter now. We were into the back half of June, and the tarmac was already soft under your boots at 7 in the morning. I counted. Nobody else was counting. She was right about that. Nobody else was counting, and I stood in my block with my clipboard and I ran the manifest twice, because that's my job, and because if I stopped doing my job I was going to shake. 1,440. Every single person who had been there on the first day. Somebody had made sure of that. Barlow was on the deck. Not on the riser, on the deck, in front of the riser, alone in blues at attention, facing the formation. I have never seen anything like it, and I hope I never do again. 1,440 people in ranks, and one man standing on the tarmac in front of them, at attention, in full dress, facing them. Nobody had told us why we were there. Captain Vance came up to the microphone. He looked like a man who had not slept in a week, and had been arguing with people well above his pay grade for most of it. He said, "On the 17th of June, on this field, a violation of good order occurred. Every one of you saw it." He stopped. An investigation was opened. That investigation has been closed. You could feel it move through the formation. Closed. They're burying it. They're actually going to bury it. 1,400 people, and I could feel the anger come up off them like heat off asphalt. Because that's what it looked like. That's exactly what it looked like. A decorated SEAL commander does something unforgivable in front of the whole base, and the Navy takes care of its own, and it goes away. I stood in my block with my clipboard and I thought, no, they don't understand. Somebody has to tell them. And then Captain Vance said, "It has been closed because Commander Barlow has entered a plea." Silence. Commander Barlow has requested, in writing, to be separated from the naval service. Silence. He has waived his right to a board. He has waived his right to counsel. He has declined the opportunity to enter anything into the record in mitigation or extenuation. Vance's jaw was working. The request has been granted. And then Vance stepped back from the microphone. And he did something that was not in any script anybody had written. And I know it wasn't, because I watched the two officers behind him look at each other. He turned to Barlow. And he said, and he had stepped away from the mic, but his voice carried. It carried all the way to the back of the fourth block, because that man had a set of lungs on him, and because you could have heard a moth land on that field. "Commander, for the record, do you have anything to say to this formation?" Wyatt Barlow came to the microphone. He was very slow about it, 4 steps, and he stood in front of it and he put his hands behind his back, and he looked out at 1,440 people. And I watched him try. I watched a man who had been shot at on 4 continents try to open his mouth in front of a formation of United States sailors and Marines, and physically not be able to do it. 3 seconds, 5, 8. His jaw moved. Nothing came out. And then he said, "I was wrong." That's it. That's what he said, 3 words, in a voice that came out of him like something being pulled out with pliers. I was wrong about the officer, about what I said, about all of it. He stopped. And then, and this is the part where my throat closes, every time, 11 years. He said, "She is the finest officer I have ever served beside." And he stepped away from the microphone. He never said her name. Not once. Not on that field, not in his separation packet, not in any document that exists anywhere in the United States Navy. Because to say her name in connection with the 11th of March, in an unclassified forum, in front of 1,440 people, would have been to spend it. And he had told me, in an office on day 7, that he was not going to let her spend it on him twice. So he stood in front of the entire base and gave up his career and his rank and his pension and 22 years, and he took the whole weight of what he'd done onto himself, and he did not say one single word that could have saved him. because the only word that could have saved him was hers. And he had decided alone that it wasn't his to use. And that's when I saw her. She'd come out. Nobody had called her forward. She wasn't in the formation. She'd been in the 4th block on the 17th, but she wasn't in it now. And I don't know where she'd been standing. I think she'd come from behind the riser, from the hangar side. She walked out onto that tarmac. And 1,440 heads turned. Discipline be damned. Every single head on that field turned, and I don't think a single block leader tried to stop it, because I think every single block leader turned too. She was in her blues. I had never seen her in her blues. 63 days on that base, and I had never once seen the ribbons. And they were wrong. I mean they were wrong for a staff officer with a folder. I stood in my block 60 feet away, and I could not read them at that distance, but I could see the shape of them, and the shape was wrong. And I heard the Master Chief on my left, a man with 28 years in, make a sound in his throat. I said, "Master Chief, what is that?" And he said, "Son, I have no idea." She walked out to where Barlow was standing. She stopped about 6 feet from him. And Wyatt Barlow, 6'3", 220 pounds, 4 combat deployments, a man who had carried a dying friend 90 meters out of a burning building, would not look at her. He was at attention, eyes forward, and she was standing directly in his line of sight, and he was looking through her at the 4th block at nothing, and his hands behind his back were shaking. I could see them shaking from 60 feet. She said something, not into the mic, just to him, quietly. I have spent 11 years wanting to know what she said, and I will never know, and I have made a kind of peace with that. Whatever it was, it took about 4 seconds. And Wyatt Barlow's face came apart. Right there, in front of 1,440 people, in dress blues on a parade deck in the sun. It wasn't crying. He didn't cry. It was worse than crying. It was a face that had been held in one shape for 3 years suddenly not being held anymore, and it came down like a wall coming down, all at once in pieces. And he closed his eyes. And he nodded. Once, and then she stepped back. And she came to attention. And Lieutenant Commander Devika Rasmussen, who could not run, who would never pass a PRT, who had stood on this same tarmac 11 days earlier and watched her file blow across it, saluted him. You don't salute a man who's being separated. I want to be clear about that, because if you've never worn the uniform you might not know, and it matters more than almost anything else in this story. There's no rule against it. Nobody's ever written a rule against it because nobody ever thought they'd have to. It's just not done. A man leaving under those circumstances is leaving. He's not owed the courtesy anymore, and everybody knows it, and the way we handle it is we look at the ground. And she was junior to him. That's the other thing. She was an 04. He was still until the paperwork cleared until 1700 that day in 05. So the salute was correct, technically, procedurally, by the book. She was rendering a courtesy to a senior officer. And every single person on that field knew it wasn't that, not even a little bit. He didn't return it. For about 2 seconds he didn't return it, and those 2 seconds were the longest I've ever stood through in my life. She was holding a salute, alone, on an open parade deck, in front of 1,440 people, to a man who was looking at the ground. I remember thinking, "Return it, sir, please return it." And then his hand came up. Slow, not sharp. Not the way that man had returned 10,000 salutes in 22 years. It came up like something being lifted against weight, and it got to his brow and it stayed. And they stood there. 2 people on a hot tarmac holding a salute. And nobody on that field moved. And then the 4th block came to attention. I didn't see who started it. I've asked. I asked for years. Petrakis thought it was a hospital corpsman named Odalis Ferreira, The Master Chief next to me was sure it was a Marine gunny in the second rank. I've never confirmed it and I've stopped trying, and honestly I think that's the right ending for that particular question. Somebody in the fourth block came to attention. And then the block. And then the block behind it. And it went across that field like wind across water. Not a command. There was no command. Nobody called it. 1,440 people came to attention on Nimitz Field, one block at a time, in a wave, in complete silence, and every one of them was watching a woman in glasses salute a man in dress blues. Captain Vance came to attention on the riser. The cadre came to attention. And Master Chief Petty Officer Roland Aged, 28 years, standing on my left, said something under his breath that I'm not going to repeat, and then he came to attention too, and I have never heard a man do it with more force in my life. She held it until he brought his hand down. Then she brought hers down. Then she executed an about-face, textbook crisp, the way you do it at Newport when you're 22 years old and terrified, and she walked off that field, past the riser, toward the hangar, and she did not look back once. And Wyatt Barlow stood alone on the tarmac in front of 1,440 people at attention. And then he walked off too. And that was the last time I ever saw either of them. Now, I've been telling this story for a long time, and there's a part right here, right at this exact moment, every time, where people want me to tell them what it meant. They want the lesson. They want the tidy thing at the end you can put on a poster. And I've spent 11 years failing to give it to them, because every time I get close to it, it turns into something else in my hands. But I'll tell you what I've got. It's not a poster. It's the truest thing I know, and it's the reason I've never been able to put this down. Here it is. Wyatt Barlow was not punished for what he did on that field. I know that sounds insane. He lost his career. He lost his rank, his pension, 22 years, his community, the only life he'd ever had. He walked out of the gate of that base a civilian with a duffel bag and no dog, and I have no idea what happened to him after. But that's not punishment. That's what he wanted. Every single piece of it. He built it. He executed it. And it went exactly the way he'd planned it in his kitchen at 3 in the morning for 61 days. He got destroyed in public by the woman he owed his life to, in front of 1,440 witnesses, and he made absolutely certain that it could never be walked back. He got what he came for. The only thing he did not plan for, the one variable he could not model, the single thing in that entire 11 days that went off script, was that she saluted him. That's what broke him. Not the investigation, not the separation, not standing on a deck in front of the whole base and saying I was wrong with his hands shaking behind his back. She saluted him. And do you understand what that is? Do you understand what she actually did, standing out there on that tarmac? He had spent 3 years building a case against himself, and he had finally gotten a court to convict him, and he was standing in the dock with the sentence read and his head down, and he was at peace. And she walked out onto that field and refused to be his executioner. She refused. He had used her, deliberately, cruelly, with full knowledge, as the instrument of his own destruction. He had made her the blade. And when the thing was done and he was on his knees and the whole world had watched, she stood up in front of 1,440 people and she said, without saying one word out loud, "I'm not your punishment. I was never your punishment. I am the officer who told you to walk away from that building, and you walked away, and you were right too, and I would tell you again tomorrow, and I will not let you carry it alone, and I will not let you die of it." He didn't want to be forgiven. That's the thing. That's the whole terrible, beautiful heart of the whole thing. Wyatt Barlow did not want to be forgiven because forgiveness meant he'd have to live with it, and living with it was the one thing he could not do. He wanted a verdict. He wanted somebody to finally say yes, It was your fault. You should have gone back in. And she wouldn't. She would not. She stood in the sun, and she gave him the only thing he had never once, in 3 years, been willing to accept. She gave him mercy. And it took him apart like nothing on this earth had ever taken him apart. I never saw her again. She was gone off the base within a week. The masking tape came off the door of that room in the icebox, and the cipher code got changed, and about a month later they used it for storage. I asked around once, just once and not very hard, and Chief Warrant Officer Petrakis looked at me across a table in the chow hall and said, "Merk, don't." And I didn't. But I'll tell you the last thing. About 4 months later, October, cold already, that gray Virginia October where the water goes the color of a nickel, a package came to my shop. No return address, base mail. Inside was an 11-cent government ballpoint pen. That's all, no note, nothing. A cheap black pen in a padded envelope. And I sat at my desk and I turned it over in my hands and I clicked it twice, and it worked. And I laughed out loud in an empty office like a crazy person. And then I put my head down on the desk and I stayed there for a while. Because I understood. She wasn't sending me a pen. She was telling me she was still out there, somewhere, in some other cold room in the back of some other building with a piece of masking tape on the door, with 11 screens and a headset and a mug and a bare green wall, listening. Telling somebody's son which way to turn. I've got 19 years in the United States Navy. I'll probably do 22, 23, and then I'll go teach high school in Ohio like every other senior chief on God's earth. And when I go, I'm not going to remember the deployments. I'm going to remember a small woman in glasses on a hot parade deck, standing in front of 1,440 people with her whole life scattered across the tarmac at her feet. And I'm going to remember that when she finally had a man's throat under her hand. She let it go. People ask me what the bravest thing I ever saw was. They expect a firefight. It was a salute.